Welcome to the AD Claude podcast series with Social Impact Founders, an initiative by the Ashank Desai Center for Leadership and Organizational Development at IIM Ahmedabad, where we document and celebrate the leadership journeys of India's homegrown social entrepreneurs who have built impactful institutions from the ground up. In today's episode, we have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Sunita Krishnan, a fighter and one of India's most fearless and anti-trafficking advocate. Sunita co-founded Prajwala in Hyderabad, 1996, driven by a determination to ensure that no survivor faces any abandonment. Over nearly 3 decades, Prajwala has assisted police force in removal of 32,200 plus women, girls, and children from places of exploitation to safe homes and provided rehabilitation services to them. Nita has been awarded India's 4th highest civilian award as Padma Shri in 2016. Nita, it is a real pleasure and honor to be talking to you and learning from you. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much, Niharika, for all the very nice and kind words. I'm extremely humbled to be here and to connect with your students and your community is definitely time worth investing in.
Thank you so much for your generosity and kindness. So let's just get right into our conversation. Sunita, could you give us a picture of what Prajwala looks like today? Its scale, range of survivors you serve, your centers, the nature of your team, and how the organization is funded. So just get us a sense of what Prajwala is and how it operates.
So, Niharika, Prajwala today, and this is Prajwala of 2026, is perhaps one of the largest anti-trafficking organization working on the very specific issue of sex trafficking and sex crime. It's a niche organization, has its own flavor because we don't do anything else other than this work. The entire organization stands on 5 pillars, starting from prevention, rescue, rehabilitation, reintegration, and advocacy. And if you look at these 5 pillars, what it means today, at one end of Prajwala, and before I go into that, Niharika, just wanted to tell you that I look at Prajwala today as a very large laboratory of experiments to check how anti-trafficking work could be done. So all the verticals I'm talking to you are different, experiments in process, different tests being done on the ground to check what works and what doesn't work. So if you look at the prevention vertical, we are at one end running education program for children of women in prostitution, providing them education as a means of preventing them from entering prostitution, or in other words, we call it as a second generation prevention program. We are at present running around 7 such centers, but over the last 30 years, and this was the first intervention of the organization way back in 1996, and it's sustained for 30 years now. We have removed around 17,000 children from being inducted into prostitution. This is like a 100% success program. The second experiment that we have done in the prevention vertical is to engage with communities which we recognize as vulnerable communities. So in vulnerability, in terms of economic vulnerability, in terms of caste vulnerability, in terms of social vulnerabilities, in terms of geographic vulnerability, looking at all those vulnerability factors, which are the communities from which the highest number of human beings are trapped or lured or fraudulently taken for purposes of exploitation. Engaging with those communities, making them, I wouldn't use the word aware, I would use the word awaken the community. Because the end goal of this community-based prevention program is to equip the community with the right kind of skills, to identify a potential victim, to look out for all those red flags for a trafficker, and also equip them with skills on if something like this happens, what is it that you need to do? Whom do you report to? How do you report to? So it's a whole community vigilant group kind of stuff that we are making. Till date, from 96 to now, we have engaged directly with around 2 million people one-to-one. And this includes children, this includes ASHA workers, this includes Anganwadi workers, includes teachers, village assistants, Panchayat Raj members and things like that. It's very
Across the nation? Across the nation?
Right now, Telangana, Andhra Pradesh and Odisha.
Okay.
There are programs that goes across the nation, but there are certain programs that requires direct physical intervention. So this is something which is very interesting because this particular program kind of feeds into several other programs, because this is the one which actually is nurturing informers from the community. So if you ask me where are we getting the information for our rescue work, it comes from this kind of. The third area that we are looking at in prevention is engaging with men and boys. Now we are working with a niche, problem, that is sex crime and sexual exploitation. The perpetrators and abusers are largely men. I wouldn't say women are not there, and because it's ironic, especially when we look at sex trafficking, 78% of the crime involves women. Women as the perpetrators, women as the procurers, women as the transporters, women as the entire mafia.
Wow.
So women is the face of this crime, especially in sex trafficking, but women also are the victims in this crime.
Correct.
And a large number of men. And again, I would say large number, and I would not say only, because we have seen women abusers using boys. But that's a very small number. The larger number is men. So engaging with men and boys to change their understanding, kind of help them review their position in the problem, how they are contributing to the problem, how they are, kind of generating the demand for this problem. Even something very small like consuming porn, could become, one of the contributory factor to generate demand for, say, children. Today in our country, we are looking at babies, like I have directly rescued 3-year-old children from a brothel who have been sold into the brothel for directly prostitution. So,
wow.
And when you look at the virtual space, you look at the online space, and you look at what is called as child sexually abusive material, which in very, very lay and perhaps very not so political term, child pornography. If you look at it, you will see even videos of 6-month babies. This is the age profile of both who are being bought and who are buying them. So engaging with men to kind of help them see their role in perpetuating the problem, and then kind of awakening them to become part of the solution is the 3 areas that we are working on the part of prevention. The second vertical is rescue. It's one of the most dramatic part of our organization, but I must say it is the easiest part because it's a short-term activity. It requires a certain amount of criminal intelligence. It requires some amount of guts and gumption, and a lot of, devil may care attitude. That is all. And it is a very, very short-term thing. It happens in a jiffy. And this is something that we do pan-India and also in 12 other countries. So our reach is across the country. So anywhere we get information, we jump into the fray and go ahead and do the rescue. And as I said, rescue is a very, very short-term activity. The real work starts after rescue. That's my third vertical, rehabilitation. Till date, we have rescued, as of this morning, 32,211 girls and women and children out of sex trafficking. While rescue is the easy task, the challenging part is rehabilitation. And we need to look at age-appropriate rehabilitation for children separately, for adults separately. We look at a trauma-informed rehabilitation, which means every plan is unique for that person. And it is one glove will not fit all kind of thing. So here in this vertical, we have been exploring and experimenting on several things, on different methods of trauma care, different methods of psychosocial interventions, different ways of imparting education, in terms of learning centers, in terms of bridge education, reaching them to the logical conclusion of mainstream education and things like that. But also looking at what works as livelihood and what vocational training. So one of the things that I kind of realized very, very early in my life is that charity is not sustainable. You can't stretch charity for a while.
Yeah.
So, depending on so-called corporate social responsibility and making feel, guilt-tripping people and say, okay, please give them jobs and all that stuff, it worked for a little while. But in the long run, it doesn't work. I don't say that I've not tried it, but I would say I've learned my lessons, and I've learned it in right time to understand that this is not the way to go about it. If we have to find sustainable solutions, then it has to be a win-win situation. The market should require them, and they should feel comfortable with the market.
Yes.
It cannot be something that we impose on them, which also doesn't work. And for me, as I'm a mental health professional by training, so for me, I was looking at options which would be, say, psychologically empowering and, also empowering vocationally. And therefore, I was one of the first ones in this country and perhaps in the world to kind of, experiment with non-conventional trades, bookbinding, welding, carpentry, fabrication for women, masonry for women. And I would say, by and large, very, very successful. Successful in 3 different ways. One is, when a girl goes through a non-conventional trade, she also kind of breaks the glass ceiling in all kinds of patriarchal understanding and gender stereotypes. That's number 1. Number 2 is psychologically, she feels superior than you. Yeah. A person who's made to feel inferior. A person who's made to feel that you are fallen, you are not up to the mark, you're worthless, you're absolutely, not worthy to come back to the society, comes to a position where he says, I am not just better than my folks, I'm better than you. So when people come and see our small industrial unit and then their eyes pop out and say, oh my God, girls are doing welding. Or when these girls take some on-site work, go to a, gated community and do the grills and all that stuff, and the entire colony comes and watches and say, oh my God, we never saw a girl doing carpentry. That is when they kind of heal in multiple ways. So it's from absolute rejection to actually a state of awe and inspiration. But much more than that, when they get poached by other small workshops and say, okay, we'll pay you 2,000 rupees more. Can you come and work with us? That's the ultimate, it says you are wanted back in the society.
You're wanted, yeah.
So we have experimented on that. So today when we talk about a rehabilitation program, Niharika, many of our children are doctors, engineers, accountants. They're doing mass comm and different things. Hundreds and thousands of our girls are, working as carpenters and welders. They've been involved in relief work and flood relief work and kind of restoring people's houses, actually making the whole house for them and giving them. And whether it was tsunami in Andaman or in Kerala, my girls had a very prominent role to play in these rehabilitation activities. Rehabilitation is kind of a multi-pronged approach.
Yes.
It means psychologically you have to heal them, vocationally or education-wise, empower them, and civic-wise, ensure them that they are as good or better than normal citizens in getting back their identity.
Sure.
So it's about Aadhaar card, it's about bank account, it's about it. The 4th vertical is reintegration, which means coming back to the society. It is, again, a task by itself. So long as they are in our safe space, there's a certain amount of safety net they are in. Coming out means actually to confront rejection and stigma head on. So a big part of our rehabilitation work is to prepare the girls for rejection, is to prepare the girls for stigma, and to say that, not everybody is going to accept you. So don't think that everybody is going to do that. Gear yourself for that kind of a taunt and everything, and prove yourself by the work you do. Huge number of girls have even opted for, among the 32,000 and odd, marriage as a way to get back to normal life. We've been responsible for around 9,500 marriages.
Yes.
But I must say, I wouldn't really know the numbers.
Right.
Because there would be a huge number who kind of chose not to be with us and say, we want to get out of the clutches of Prajwala.
Correct.
We don't want Prajwala's name to... So we would go out and find our own way. So there are many like that too.
Sure.
So and as I said, all that I see in Prajwala is a big laboratory. So everything that we learn from our experiments, our failures, our successes, feeds into our advocacy program. Today, Prajwala is at the forefront, advocating for a anti-trafficking law, policies in several states. We have been successfully advocating policy in Assam. It's the draft that we have given that Assam government has adopted as their policy. Telangana has adopted our policy. Andhra has adopted our policy. Chhattisgarh is adopting our policies. Several states are doing it. And each of these policies have been tested on the ground for its efficacy. These are not academic papers. It comes from actually what works on the ground. And that is, so today, what is Prajwala? If you ask me, I would say it's a successful demonstration of anti-human trafficking work. It is a clear message to the world that there are certain things that people thought is an inevitable reality of the world. For example, sex trafficking in the form of prostitution is an inevitable reality. You can't change it. So long as humanity was there, it will be there. We have created a dent in that thought process and say, things can change. And that's what Prajwala means today. Prajwala is an example of hope and an example of possibilities.
Very nice. Very nice. Thank you so much for the detailed answer, and also so peppered with hope and reality. Would like to ask you, so this is a lot of work that you're doing. So who is your team, and how large is your team, and what kind of people are part of your team?
So I think your previous question also had something about funding. So I'll add both of that together with this. I have a team of 200, and a significant portion of the team are survivors themselves, survivors of trafficking who have joined our mission. I wouldn't say the number is very high, but it is constituting right now around 30% of the team. So, and it's a significant number because survivor involvement in not as survivor, but as people equivalent to professionals.
Yes.
Contributing their skills in the anti-trafficking mission. I would say 30% of the organization. That means of the 200, 30% of them are survivors. The rest of the 150 and more are professional staff with a social work degree, most of them. We do also have a huge number of people just from the community who relate to the cause in some way or other. Maybe they are connected in some way to the cause. Maybe it was a relative. People who join hands. 60% funded from sources within the country.
Okay.
Among the 60%, a huge number are just individuals, people, common people.
Very nice.
One of the biggest billionaire who supports our work is a rickshaw puller. He gives us 11 rupees every day, and this is going on for the last 25 years. So people who engage with us for a long time. Maybe, small, big, whatever. The organization is funded by a huge world of people within the country who believe this cause is important. Around 40% again comes from the Indian diaspora outside.
Okay.
And yes, we have some international donors who have been long-term partners with us. They are international donors who kind of, reverberate our own ideological position. So I think you must also know upfront that Prajwala is one of the organizations which has a very, very, very interesting optics around the world and narrative about the thing. We are generally understood as a very arrogant organization, especially by donors, because we are not a project-funded organization.
Absolutely.
We are a need-based organization, and everything in the organization has evolved, organically. It is not like I suddenly thought this one will work and this one will not work. It kind of moves like organic pace because I founded the organization, and, my journey was, and it is very well written in my I Am What I Am, and that gives you a very interesting journey chronicling of how that organic part worked out. So we've been one of the very few organizations who have told the donors that if you care for our felt needs and if you are sharing the same ideology that we have, then we take money from you. Because we also have a very clear position. We're hardcore abolitionists. We are anti-prostitution, anti-slavery. And there is a huge lobby within this country and globally too, which believes that prostitution should be legalized. And we are completely opposed to that. So we don't take money from any organization which has, I would say, even a doubt about their position. Even if they are neutral, we don't touch them. because that's a dangerous group to have. We are not there kind of thing. And share our position, we take money from you. Some people we take money.
Yes, yes. But it also reduces some of the friction that possibly comes from having money, which comes with an ideology or comes with a certain expectation. So
Absolutely.
I think that friction definitely reduces.
Yeah.
As
So we have enough friction on the ground, Niharika. We can't
of
find.
course, you don't.
We don't need that extra friction
You
from
don't
top.
need-
It is too much.
Correct. Yes. So just so that, and I will come back to a little bit of your work in a minute, but just to be with the team for a moment, managing 200 people is not actually an easy task, and you seem to be the one who's conceiving, running, motivating people. So what are your insights in having them do the best possible for the group that they're working with?
One is, I think every team works completely by example. What you are and how you lead and how you conduct yourself is critical part of everything that you say, because what you say, what you don't say, what's verbal, what's not verbal, and how you live your life. Big part of what the team sees. For me, it's worked in a big way because I'm a full-time volunteer, and because I'm a full-time volunteer, I'm not tied by the strings of my existence with the organization. So it gives you a certain kind of moral strength. Speak what you can and you do in the way you want to do, and to stand up for the right reasons. That is one part of it. But another part of it is how do you continue to keep the motivation alive? Because our field is an everyday risk-taking field.
Absolutely.
Every time we remove a child, this morning we have removed 7 people out of a brothel. So if you look at that 7 people, there would be 70 people living on the 7 people.
Wow.
So I have made 70 enemies this morning.
Sure.
Now the 70 enemies are going to hit me at every possible way. They will hit me from every side in every way because they are also hurt. It's their revenue that I have, kind of dismantled. So you don't have a day where there's no drama here, and therefore there's a lot of emotional depletion, doing what you do, and you don't have a kind of a 9-to-5 job kind of thing. You have to be available, accessible at any time. So what matters is within the time that is your working hours, how do you include so many things that will keep the, not just a motivation high, but it also acts as a healing space. So if you look at all our campuses, they are built in a certain way, they're structurally created in such a way, which is meant for, healing environment. You enter the space, you feel a sense of calmness into you. If you look at several of the activities that we do, it may look so rudimentary, Every other day we are doing some puja or some iftar or some other way of the cross or some funny things. And it's like, am I trying to act extra secular? But actually I'm not. I am trying to create every possible means for people to have, let go, delete, and seek that spiritual energy that can give you a strength within you. Similarly, have something like, traditional day where everybody is every month. It's not like once a year program. Every month and everybody is cooking for everybody. And all this is happening with 200 people. Now, these are kind of small activities kind of integrated into the running of the organization as a way of life, so that everybody gets a little space, every time for them, their own self, for them to kind of breathe in, to kind of assimilate what is happening. I will not deny, in spite of all this, there is a certain kind of desensitization that comes into play. It does come into play. And for me, it is rather painful because I have become better professional in the last 35 years, but I've never been desensitized. And that's a very thin line,
Yeah. Well, it's a huge struggle. I think that happens in police, that happens in multiple things. It just becomes like every day becomes such a humdrum for everyone. Any violent incident becomes humdrum. So I think that's a huge challenge for you that you're managing. But also like a true mental health professional, you're also saying that you've created healing spaces within the organization so that people are not burnt out because you can't really help anybody if you're yourself depleted in that sense. Amazing.
Yeah.
Also with your school, like you have a learning centers as well, right? How does that work? So do you have trained teachers? Are they part of these 200, or do you partner with school to do this work?
So we can't afford trained teachers. Having spoken about funding, being a grassroots organization, we have our limitations on how much we can give with just nothing, with just this 200.
Sure.
And if you look at the scale of the organization, the learning centers, the shelters, all the ground programs, we are spending around 90 lakhs a month, and that itself to sustain is a challenge. So we have very modest salaries, not really great salaries. So 50% of the time, so-called premier institutions like TIS and other places, they don't even come near us because we don't even pay that kind of salary. So us is people who have completed their 10th and 12th standard, train them as teachers, and train them with professional teachers. So our partnership comes with IB schools who provide the training for our teachers.
Wonderful.
So they have kind of adopted us, and every year they do residential training for us. We also kind of partner with other organizations like Pratham, who are into, say, open school learning and things like that. So they're very, very good in that. And so a big part of a training component comes through partnership. But the execution work is done by our own team. And that they are part of this too.
And so these people with the very, as you said, modest salary, do they leave you after a while, or do they continue to stay? What's your attrition like? In that sense?
It is ironic. Professionals, or rather, I would say 20% of the professionals would leave after 2 years. Once they get the basic training from us, then they have big demand in the market. Any trained in Prajwala is huge. I've known of institutions who don't even interview any Prajwala product, and they're taken like poached lock, stock and barrel from here. But then over a period of time, there have been a very significant number who stayed on, who got immensely engaged with the cause, and they identify themselves with the cause. I must say, Niharika, they didn't come like that. They all came as fresh graduates to me. Nobody came thinking that I want to fight trafficking. They came because either they loved my image or they needed a job. Nothing more than that. This was not in their list at all. I'm yet to get even one star who said, it was the cause that brought me to you, to fight trafficking, and that's why I came to you. Yeah. It's mostly, I need a job and I've come to you. I've seen a huge number of professionals developing, a solid commitment for the cause and have stuck to us. So we've had staff who have been with us for more than 20 years. But it is the staff who are not professionals. It's like these teachers or the community members whom we have engaged with actually become my torchbearers and work. They bring in a commitment, because once they work with us, even they can get better jobs outside. But they choose, and many of them have been with me for more than 25 years.
Wow.
Some of them have their lives have ended with my organization. Like, I start here and I die here kind of situation. There have been like that, but it is, if you're not able to hold people after the first 2 years, then you can't. There are enough who leave.
That's right. So, but what you're also saying is that, in a way, once people start to identify with the cause, that's when they actually become more committed.
Yes.
Even though they may not earlier have been committed to that.
Absolutely. See, and also, I think I would put it in more pragmatically this way. They have to identify with the cause. They have to find an identity with the cause. They have to have certain kind of, what do you say? What's the right word? I sometimes lose my English. When they are recognized for the cause and they are appreciated for it, and you have to create space for the outside world to see these. If you are the only face, then you are done deal. So while in the public domain, people like you all might only kind of engage with me because I'm the articulate English face of the organization. But if you go to my police officers in the entire country where my team works, and nobody there, they will ask for Ali, they will ask for Nazia, they will ask for Shrikant. they know this very elusive madam somewhere. So, madam hai, who don't even know that madam. Similarly, the judges. Similarly, all our grassroots partners. They have no ideas who Sunita Krishnan. This ghost, Sunita. The person who's getting, affirmation of the identity is the person who's on the grassroots. And that is the space one has to make. You can't be, be there everywhere, all the credit. So you have to create a space where people also get what is due for them. You can't be the face. And for me, it has been like, I would say nothing noble about this, but a practical decision. See, on the ground, there was a point where I was required in the front face. But a point came when my face had to go behind for security concerns. I was already beaten up more than 17 times, and more getting exposed was not so practical. I had to push another person forward, And then when I'm pushing that person forward, it's a practical thing. Why would this person do it if he's not getting gratification out of it? So next award that the organization is getting, push this person to get it. So these are all practical decisions and not anything noble about it. So I want to clarify that these are all strategic responses.
No, and very thank you for sharing that, because I think one of the basic needs that every human being is to have some visibility.
Absolutely. And especially when they're doing the work.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's one of the most painful things that, somebody is doing the Dockney's work and somebody else is taking the credit for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
that's
so
bad leadership.
I have been very clear from the beginning that yes, I am the face for fundraising. I am the face for advocacy. So to that extent, my face works. But for everything else, it is my team which has to be in the front. And people like it, people don't like it. I don't care. This is a leader who represents us, and I stand by that leader.
Correct.
So that kind of decentralized understanding from top to bottom is something that, so today even a coordinator level person is actually engaging with the commissioner of police, and so much so that recently I went to meet a commissioner and he says, I've already met your team and everything, and I've met Prajwala and all, said, I've met your team leader and all, said, I said, yes, sir, one of my team members, I'm supposed to be the head of the organization. So that guy actually had a double take. He said, I thought he was the head of that thing. I said, yes, he is the head for the whole organization. I am there. And I actually felt like a worm to tell him, no, I am the big lady here. And, but yeah, so, several things, people also want easy way of handling an organization. And they want to, at one end, you keep talking about succession and, who after you, but then you don't allow this person to move out. You only want that person to come and give you the speech. You only want that person to come and engage in an interview. You will never call her somebody who's down there. So, it's kind of a tough balance to make. But yes, we maintain it.
Now, also, so one is the outer face, which you have very nicely said that that's what you do. What about decision making within organizations? So how does that happen? Because that's another motivation tool, right?
So over a period of time, it has evolved. Again, as I said, Niharika, it has been an organic evolution. Upon a time, I was everything for the organization. I would do the rescue. I was the first cook. I was the first teacher. I come from that 100% grassroots space. For a very long time, I was the key decision maker. And it took, a little while for me to also kind of negotiate within myself to let go,
Of course.
Because, sometimes what happens is when you have gone through life-threatening spaces like attempt to life and things like that, you become extremely possessive. Possessive not of your space or your position, but about the organization's safety.
Correct.
And then you think that you know the best because you've gone through the worst, so you will not make a mistake for the organization. I believed that for a very long time, and I still do believe that in some ways, but it has taken a lot of work within me to create that space for others to make their mistakes. And, decision making is about making mistakes.
Absolutely.
And learning from those mistakes. So now my job in the last 15 years has been to help my team make their mistakes, hold them tight as they learn from their mistakes. And that's been a tough journey, I would say, because even the team gets used to, somebody is taking the decision, let her make the decision. She is fixed for the responsibility. I don't have any accountability. She took it. It's her job. For them to take that, okay, now it may fall on me. And, these are not like, we're not a business.
Correct.
Our decisions will affect it's life and death issue of a human being, and things go wrong. It can go wrong, horribly wrong, and you have to be on your toes, especially when you're dealing with a mafia. You have to take the right kind of decision. How much is the public exposure you require? Where will you withdraw? Where you'll never come before the media? Where you will say and where you will not say? Where is it that you will hit and where you will never hit? These are all decisions that comes from experience.
Yeah.
So I allowed my team to get that experience for a long time. Now I have, in the last 15 years, and I would say in the last 4 years more, when the team is now reconstituted as a team which is self-managing the organization. So we have a PRC, a peer review committee, which actually reviews each other's work, gives so from a single person leader, it's become a team of leaders who take collective decisions. So again, the fear that it will all come on me is gone for that person. It's a collective decision that people take, and it's a collective accountability they bear, and I wouldn't say we have reached the pinnacle of this process yet. It is still to go a long way.
It's always work in progress, but I
yes,
think so
we are on the journey.
Yeah, so amazing. Also, all the best with all the work that you've been doing on that front, because that's a very difficult work for leaders to do.
Actually, Niharika, again, I would say everything about Prajwala is an organic journey.
Yes.
And, 4 years back, I was diagnosed with cancer. And that started this consolidation. See, till you're not in that space, that, something is pushing you kind of thing. Things were going at a certain speed. Then a point came when this happened and I had to really take a few steps back and say, oh my God, I was diagnosed with lung cancer. And I said, okay, now one has to think about this. And then I was in remission for 3 years, and April 2025, I'm back with a relapse, and now I'm past my 4th stage of lung cancer. So now I'm supposed to be in my final stages. I am in a space where I have to really practically understand where my organization will move. Thankfully, because of this organic process, and I am both thanks to cancer, I would say. Gratitude for this health condition, I would say. The decentralization of leadership and power has happened seamlessly. Now it's not like, how can we report to this person when Madam is still there? Now it is like, we should not trouble Madam. It is a match, it is but, our responsibility to, allow this leadership to flourish, because that is what is going to give her some rest. So, you see in a weird kind of way, it is just working out. Because see, Niharika, you need to understand the kind of leader I am. I come from a very strong drive. I'm one of those mad persons who kind of takes the entire space. A huge number of people who will not even come on the stage with me thinking that I will hijack the entire space. I can just eat you up. That's the kind of person I am. So if you look at me as a persona, I'm like this larger than life persona, I can die for anybody. I've done all that, I'm like this huge hero figure. So, when you look at succession, you're looking at this hero figure being replaced by another hero, right? Otherwise it's going to be difficult, especially if this person is alive and kicking, so everybody's like, you're not Madam, you're not doing what she did, But all that has beautifully and so beautifully in such a lovely landscape, kind of easily, seamlessly moved, And now it's like, okay, there is a legacy that we need to carry. And we need to live up to this legacy. And as a legacy is not mine, it's a legacy of the organization. That is something the team is able to now see it. See, every work that we have done is their work, Perhaps I've been part of it. I've been with them. I'm a co-traveler like them. For them to understand, that yes, all of us have been co-travelers, and there's 30 years of Prajwala has brought so much in. We need to carry that in the same manner that it was carried for the last 30 years. So, and that seamlessly happened now. So I would say I'm in a point where I feel comfortable. I'm not a worried person. Oh my God, will they have to accept another leader? But at the same time, I'm also very practical. Any founder of any organization carries certain kind of madness that cannot succeed. There is no such succession plan for that. Most founders become founders because they have certain qualities. They have risk-taking abilities, they are multi-talented, they are multi-skilled. So in one person, there is many things.
Sure.
You may never get, a succession of a leader who will have all the qualities in one person. Because the person who has it will found another organization. Why would they take over my organization? They have enough skills to independently operate on their. So I'm left with people who may not have all the skills. And therefore, what works in organizations like mine is collective leadership.
Yeah.
And a certain kind of democracy within leaders, to see how that can be managed. And a certain accountability framework at every level to, maintain and sustain that kind of leadership. Because in this kind of work, Niharika, every thread is important.
Absolutely.
I may give big speeches. If my counselor bungles it up, I'm done. Forget my counselor. My security guard bungles up, I'm done. So everything I speak, I say, it has to be uniformly transferred and disseminated till the last person. And then from the last person to the first person, it has to be the same language, same position, only then the organization works. It can't be like I say therapy is this or healing is this and somebody else down there says something else.
Sure.
It doesn't work.
Sure.
Because we are walking the act every second.
Yeah.
These are not speeches that we can make.
No.
We have to walk the talk every second,
Yeah.
And when you have survivors as your partners in the organization, they are your conscience keeper.
Correct.
They will kick you if they think that you have deflected from the main path, So, I've been lucky that in the last 30 years or more, I have been able to put those checks and balances from down to top in terms of conscience keepers at every level. So even if I go wrong, there's somebody else to nudge me and say, sorry, you're not doing it right. We need to correct it. Yeah. And again, we've not reached the end of our game.
No, obviously not. Yeah.
It's work in progress.
Wonderful. And so, honestly, I have a little bit of a pit in my stomach because of what you just shared about your remission, about your cancer coming back. So, I wish you recovery and but let me continue my question.
Sure.
Because, it's a huge learning for us as well to hear from you. I think one of the things that you already mentioned that, when you've today rescued 7 people, you've possibly angered 70 people because of, their dismantling of their livelihoods and so on and so forth. And also you work with some communities where, they think it's okay to steal others' babies to sell for prostitution. You work with communities that think that that's the only way of life and so on and so forth. So how do you really engage with a certain level of equanimity and the ability to still engage with these communities? Because I know you can't not do it, but what helps you to actually engage?
I would answer this in a different way. There was a time that I would actively engage with all of them, and at that time we had to make too many compromises when we engaged with these communities.
Okay.
And that's the beginning of Prajwala. From 1996 to around, say, 2005, I was, for the first 10 years of the organization, actively engaged with this community.
I see.
When we actively engaged with this community, we were kind of forced to, make our own compromises. For example, we would rescue, but not file a case, It would be like, okay, I removed 3 girls. I know who are doing it because they're part of the community there, But if I file the case, the entire community will become against me.
Correct.
And, my first staff was a former pimp.
Mm.
So my biggest worry was he would be attacked or killed. And that's what happened. One of my staff was, stabbed to death. So those were the initial adjustments and compromises we made, because you're working in the community that you're trying to disrupt. You want to take some steps and then you're not able to take several steps. I think after around 10 years, which lasted also my God syndrome, I would say, because first few years you also feel like a hero because you're doing things that nobody else has done. And not only are you doing things, you're doing it in a way that nobody has attempted. You're putting your life under threat every minute. You are jumping into the shark's mouth and removing girls, because all the rescue the first few years were done directly by me. I would go in, I would pull out, I get beaten up, I go to the hospital, get a surgery done, come out and do one more rescue. So it was a great high in my life, and that high gets into your head,
Sure.
You also think, you're the all and you're the, the hero that everybody should bow their head before, and kind of a moral, high that you live in, and the condescending attitude with which you look at the world. What the hell are you people doing after all? You're all armchair characters and I'm like this great. It took me a while to understand how unsustainable. I wouldn't say I have no regrets for the way I lived, because the way I lived, I know now exactly how it is to be done.
Yes.
I wouldn't have known if I knew the wisdom firsthand,
Sure.
And therefore, no regrets or nothing to say that, oh, I did something wrong. But then, I had to lose a human being to first have my reality check and say, this is a path which is unsustainable. This is a path which is not okay. At the same time, I need to also take a call on what is it that I want. Do I just want to rescue girls? Or do I want to dismantle this completely? If I want to dismantle this community completely, I can't work with them. I can't engage with them. I can't be, curry cutletting them in the daytime and killing them in the nighttime. It just doesn't work.
Mm.
And therefore, I had to take a call on saying that, okay, now distance.
Mm.
And when we distance, it became antagonistic.
Hmm.
So today I have reached a point where we are in an antagonistic situation. Even my sight in any of the areas would start, giving jitters to people. Why is she here? Is something going to happen now? Now the boundaries have been drawn clearly.
Hmm.
But we didn't start from there.
Correct.
We didn't start from there and we didn't evolve like that. Having said that, I have always kept a window open for anybody who wants to engage with us, and that's what happened during COVID time.
Mm.
During COVID time, when everything went into a doldrum, we were one of the very few who was extending relief support for these communities.
Mm.
We were the only ones who were giving them groceries and things like that, And surprisingly enough, they trusted only us, because that is the kind of image that we had built, that we are people of our word, And if we say we are going to help you, then we'll help you. So that little window is open for them. So there are many who use that window, who says, I cannot come out but take care of my child, or I cannot come out but I will help you get somebody out, So two varieties of people who are very strongly available in our life right now. But otherwise, as a programmatic strategy, we don't engage with them.
Which makes a lot of sense, I think.
Yeah,
It really
yeah.
does make a sense. You can't go to bed with your enemy.
It's very difficult, yeah. And that's why perhaps, so many programs done by the health ministry and the so-called HIV/AIDS program, they see trafficking, they see violations happening right in front of them. But because they have to conserve their project, they cannot, take the positions that is required. So they end up endorsing it by their silence.
Correct. All right. So, also just a couple more questions and then It's been such a great conversation. You also have, I think I read somewhere that there are a lot of your survivors or the people that you pull out have HIV AIDS, or they may be infected or have no way out. So do you also have partnership with doctors, medicine specialists to be able to actually provide them relief and dignity through their lives?
Absolutely. Not, so if you look at the list of our partners, it's not just the people in education stream who are partnering. There are corporates who are partnering for several other things. Similarly, health is a large section because all these girls, irrespective of HIV AIDS, health is one of the biggest collateral damage for a sex trafficked person. From sexually transmitted infections to reproductive tract infections to huge amount of, brain injuries. 78% of my girls suffer from traumatic brain injuries, TBI. And so health is a very, very big area of concern for us. So we partner with Apollo Hospital, who provide us full-time doctor, nurses, and things like that. But apart from that, we also, with psychiatrists and mental health hospitals for psychiatry.
Okay.
Of course, we have tie-up with all the government hospitals for antiretroviral drugs and things like that for the HIV infected. Many of our survivors are working with us who are HIV positive, and they're living a very fulfilled life. That is absolutely not a problem. See, you can live with HIV for hundreds of years. There's enough and more of medical intervention today to help you, sustain your life, provided you live a very healthy life. It's, in terms of take care of your opportunistic infections and take your antiretroviral drugs on time. Many of them have been surviving for more than 20 years happily.
Very nice. Very nice. Very nice. All right. So I think we have already spoken about the issue of succession, which you are saying you have been managing, and of course also some have been forced to manage in a way, which is amazing. And this is about your current conversation of how technology is actually perpetuating and making it possible for people to lurk and demand child sexual abusive material and so on and so forth. I'd really like to hear a little bit about that. If there are anything that young people or we all can do to support, because it seems like, again, by being silent or not by even acknowledging the problem, we are all becoming part of it.
Absolutely, Niharika. We need to understand that this is instrument that we have, technology right now that we're using for this podcast has its great benefits, but it also has its own bane in terms of how world has become one single platform or single playground for both the good and the bad to come on same space. A whole lot of perpetrators and abusers are lurking in these platforms, using every tricks of the trade. Now their playground is a bigger, wider space. Also, their reach to the most vulnerable is also in a wider scope, in terms of there's no borders here, whether it's Facebook, Insta, whether it's Snapchat, YouTube, whatever, the world is at your fingers. And so it is one of the greatest challenges of our time, and how to make these platforms more safe for women and girls, and especially for children. Online gaming has become one of the biggest conduit for trapping young boys and children. And what is very shocking and surprising, Niharika, we did a nationwide study on how cyber technology is enabling human trafficking. And one was a decoy operation on various platforms to check how easy it is to access CSAM, that is child sexually abusive material. One of the things that we found out was, apart from the ease at which we can gather stuff, like applications like Telegram and things like that, the ease of business is one part of the story, and we'll keep that aside. The fact that, a whole lot of young children have been made perpetrators by use of technology. You trap a child on an online gaming platform. The child is indebted. The child is, exhausted all the resources in hand. Maybe the child has even stolen the credit card in the family to keep playing, gaming. It's a gambling of a different kind. And then the child has no means to, but is compelled to feel. And then there are this live, friends who are very casually telling this child, why don't you just go and make a video of your child, your friend, take him to a bathroom, or go behind the building and do it and upload it, and you'll get your points back, or you'll get your credit back. So, more than 30% of the videos that we accessed through these platforms were self-generated videos.
Wow.
Which means children making videos of children.
Yeah.
And that is the most frightening part of today's reality, where if we now also, we all have a tendency, we never wake up,
No.
And it's like, it's not happening to me or my family or anybody else. So it's like the war, war, we were least bothered about the Ukraine war or what's happening in Gaza or what happened. Now when the Iran thing is happening and you are not getting your LPG cylinder, everybody is thinking about the war. So unless it doesn't hit you somewhere, you don't even wake up. And one of the things that I would urge people who are watching this podcast with you is to, wake up and, make online safety as a part of their existence with their children, with their family, and start practicing digital detoxification. This screen time that you have in your life, believe me, it's one of the most hazardous things that you're doing to yourself and your family. And what your child is learning by your example is going to be so detrimental. So even if you start a digital detox campaign, you'll be really, really doing a great service to humanity, because online safety and safety for women and girls on various platforms. And you guys are from IIM, and in all probability, some of you all will become corporate heads and, may lead companies. If you are a head of a tech company, please make sure all safeguarding protocols which protects, the safety of women and children are integrated. It may not make great business sense, but it is great ethical business. And I think one needs to start practicing ethical business.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for that message. The last question I have is again for maybe some of our young friends are watching this and may consider entering a space like the anti-trafficking or survivor support space. What would you want to say to them if they want to make this choice, or any other difficult areas that they might choose to work in? And I hope they choose.
If you choose, don't come here for tourism. This is not a tourism joint for you to come and see, experience as an internship program or something else, and then you go back to your commercial life. Maybe better sensitized, but never to work in the space. If you're coming here, come prepared. As much as it requires your passion and drive, it requires a lot of skills. It's from perseverance to resilience. You need to really work on yourselves, because this is one sector where you don't get easy results, and you don't have any easy answers. And anti-trafficking does not happen by speeches. Many people, so-called very learned people who enter the space, they enter and they conduct football matches or give speeches or go for TEDx's, and they think that they are doing anti-trafficking work. That doesn't work. You need to soil your hands. You need to engage with what's happening on the ground. And more than anything else, you need to sustain. If you come here just for a day and then things go bad and you go running back, change that you're bringing, change is inevitable, but it will take time. And believe in yourself. You don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are many like us who have done something. If you want, read my memoir. It will give you my way of doing things.
Sure.
And I'm sure there are others who have done similar work. Read it. Gain perspective. You don't need to follow. You have to find your own destiny. You have to carve it out yourself. But today, unlike what people like me went through 30 years back, where there were very less precedents and nobody had tried several things, today at least you have some amount of lessons learned at your disposal, which could be your starting point. But do that research, prepare yourself, equip yourself with the right kind of skills, and then enter. It's a war. In a war, untrained people don't get into as soldiers. Remember that. keep yourself rightly and coming. If I have survived for 35 years, you can too.
It was so amazing to talk to you. I hope you continue to do the work, and
Yes.
this community, at some point in our lives we'll see a reduction in this, if not a
In
complete.
fact, that's my dream, Niharika. If somebody asks me what is my vision for Prajwala, my vision for Prajwala is the day we can close it down.
Absolutely.
And there's no need of an organization like Prajwala.
Yeah.
That's the day that we are working for.
Yeah, आपके मुंह में घी शक्कर ऐसे ऐसा हो. All right.
Thank you.